You probably tuned me out by now. Welcome, folks. So this is our lesson about assimilation and the Indian Act. We'll also be touching a little bit on the Métis in Canada, although some of that is review from grade 7, and there's not really a ton of new information there this year. So looking at assimilation, you may want to actually download that 4.4 PowerPoint, because there's actually John A. Macdonald in puppet form, and he does a little musical performance in which you also see a quote from him that the goal of the government's legislation is to assimilate the First Nations as speedily as possible. And so he was straight up about that they wanted to either have them give up their native identity or to die. And in any case, the goal was to have no First Nations with a distinct culture that were different from the rest of British Canadians. You may wonder why I'm clutching this little stuffed plushie. Well, it's a cold day here in the portable, but also it's kind of a terrifying topic. So you might want to grab something soft to hold on to during this lesson. So the Indian Act was brought in 1876. It was actually under Alexander Mackenzie's government, a liberal government that was sandwiched in between John A. Macdonald's conservative government. So both parties were pretty much all on board with the assimilation that was happening here. That's not to say there weren't individuals who were opposed to this, but by and large, mainstream Canadian society was totally happy with what was going on there. And so what was going on? Well, they were planning on having Indian status. So Indian status, this gave the rights to the treaty benefits that we discussed last time. So things like the annuities, the annual payments, the hunting and fishing rights, and education and health rights that were provided to the First Nations, lacking though as they may have been. So if you had Indian status, you could not vote in federal elections until 1960. That change came. So the thinking was, if you gave up your Indian status, though, then you became a full Canadian citizen. So you were essentially a second-class citizen as a First Nations person. Now, very few, less than 100 First Nations in Canada people chose to actually give up their Indian status. For most of them, either the pride of their identity or the treaty benefits they got were seen as being more valuable than voting in an election. I mean, it makes sense because neither party was really going to do much for them. And so the government, in addition to this, part of their assimilation plan was to go after the children, to teach them from a young age to reject their culture. And so they set up residential schools for this. This was now under John A. Macdonald. He was back in power, but it would continue for over a century. And so eventually, though, the churches, the Catholic and Anglican churches were the biggest two. They said, we're happy to help you out to save you some money, federal government, if you let the kids go to our schools. And the government thought this sounds fantastic. And the churches, they got a lot more people to join up under their religion. And so they were off to the races. Some of the punishments were extremely harsh that they, as children, would receive. For example, if you went off on your own without any other kids present, you would have to kneel on a stone floor for several hours at a time. And sometimes when I teach my classes this topic, this is totally voluntary, but I ask, does anyone want to try kneeling on the floor and seeing what this is like? And usually there are a few volunteers, and it's extremely uncomfortable. And after about 5 minutes, they say, oh, this is really painful. In addition to that, they were separated from their parents. This is something that even in cases where there wasn't actual abuse going on, it was very traumatic, being ripped from your family. Parents, if they chose to refuse to send their kids to school, they could go to jail. So there wasn't really a choice. And so even if the schools were on the reserves, and sometimes they were thousands of kilometers away, other times they were right up close, even if they were on the reserves, the kids were not allowed to see their parents. Because they didn't want to have that cultural connection there. They would have their hair cut right away. They were not allowed to have the long hair that was seen as dignified for an Aboriginal boy. In addition, when they spoke their native languages, so that if their first time, this is the standard punishment, you'll read this on the PowerPoint, the first time they would basically get no food. Second time they would try speaking their language, it was no food and a beating. And the third time it was said was considered disobedience and punished as such. So, I mean, that's pretty ominous sounding. They've already had really harsh punishment. What could be even worse than no food and a beating? Yes. So in addition to this, they had eventually really poor conditions, pretty much right from the onset. And especially by the early 20th century, the government decided to look into this. They commissioned a study into residential schools. And it was found in 1906 that it was terrible, that 6 to 12% of kids were dying every year. So imagine at our school, we have about 700 people. That is anywhere from about 42 to 84 people dying a year. So pretty much could be like several classes, perhaps an even entire grade that's dying off. And this was a regular thing. So you can imagine part of the reason they died, the poor ventilation allowed diseases like tuberculosis to spread very rapidly. And so what did the government do about this? Well, they decided to fire the guy who did the report. So basically, if there's no cry, no foul, right? And yeah, it was also there were some other kids there as well too. This was a common problem. My grandfather and great uncle, though they were not First Nations, they were sent to a residential school in Quebec after their parents had both died and their stepmother didn't want to raise them. And my great uncle actually died at the age of 10. He contracted tuberculosis and passed away. So really brutal conditions. My grandfather, they were Catholic nuns who ran the school, and he basically wouldn't take communion for many, many years because of the traumatic experiences he had had in this residential school. He never talked about it though, so we don't know exactly what happened. But we do know that commonly beatings were a very normal part of the procedure. There was also widespread sexual abuse as well, and just on the constant racism, being told your culture is inferior. And yet, for many of them, the First Nations, okay, they're getting beaten down in their own culture, but they're not seeing much in the European culture that they're wanting to embrace. I mean, that's like the bully, right? So many of them were left without a sense of identity. They were kind of stranded in between and would often turn to substance abuse and crime as sort of outlets with all the trauma that they'd experienced. By the 1920s, it looked like John A. Macdonald's dream of wiping out the First Nations, and he died in 1891, by the way, so he was long gone. But by the 20s, the First Nations numbers had really gone down. But then they started to level off, and today they're actually the largest, fastest growing population group in the country. So they managed to prove resilient in that way. By the 1950s, the government actually did a study on general living conditions on the reserves. And they found that actually they were really deplorable, really awful poverty. It was pretty much like a developing country. And this time, though, the government actually wanted to do something about it. And so in the 1960s, actually by 1969, Pierre Trudeau, who was then prime minister, he came up with this idea it was known as the White Paper. And the plan was, let's get rid of these reserves, because these reserves are horrible places to live, and the poverty is abject, and get rid of the Indian Act and basically have the First Nations just live like other Canadians, and then they will enjoy the same high quality of life. So you might think this maybe sounds like a good idea, but the First Nations, no, they said, we don't like this, because they said we have lost and sacrificed so much, and these treaties and the Indian status, this is what little we have left, and now you want to take that from us too? And they, for the first time, many First Nations groups united. They called it the National Indian Brotherhood. Today it's known as the Assembly of First Nations. They got together and they had such a strong protest against this that the government backed down. And to the point where eventually Pierre Trudeau, he realized, he came to appreciate their perspective. And 13 years later, when he was still prime minister, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, when they implemented that, he enshrined these First Nations rights that he had once been looking to just level with everyone else's. He said these are going to be in the charter, so they cannot be taken away. And so that was kind of a win. In 2008, the First Nations received an apology from the federal government under Stephen Harper about for the residential schools, and the survivors, and we call them survivors because thousands of these kids died, and many of them had other just horrible abuse. They received monetary payments. The concern was, though, that, okay, beyond this, is the government still doing enough? Are we creating conditions that things will get better? Like, we've kind of done what we could for the past, not that it makes up for the trauma, but it is controversial, because oftentimes there will be studies and commissions and recommendations, but these things can cost a lot of money. They can make a lot of commitment, or can require different levels of government to give up some of their power. And we're kind of hesitant to do that. So we're making, yeah, small progress in improving First Nations quality of life, but definitely there are still some concerns. In terms of the Métis, with Louis Riel, you may know the story of him. We looked at him during Louis Riel Week and his fight for the Métis rights, and how the Métis, after winning some land rights in Manitoba, they were not allowed to have their land altogether. So they sold off their land in Manitoba, moved west to Saskatchewan. And they've had a lot of trouble because they weren't an original First Nation. They grew up from the combination of First Nations and European marriages. They were not really fully accepted by either culture. But gradually, they've continued the struggle in the court systems. In the 1980s, they received recognition in the Charter of Rights of Freedoms as a First Nations group. In 2003, the Supreme Court found that First Nations do have treaty rights, that they do have the right to these special benefits. So their story has been even more a recent struggle for recognition, and because they face discrimination too from both the European, and they couldn't fit in to the First Nations communities because they were seen as not fully First Nation either. So those are our stories of assimilation. For your activity that you have, it is Assimilation Nation. And so what you can do is you are actually going to come up with a plan to, if you had to assimilate in your school, a certain group. So we're not talking an ethnic group. We're talking about a group like the jocks or the nerds or the goths or the preps. The preps are people who wear like fancy clothes, like going to prep school. Like I think the way I'm dressed might be considered kind of preppy. A plan to assimilate them. So for example, with the jocks, you might say we're banning sports. Oh, hey, maybe someone's implementing this plan this year. For the band students, you might say, oh, no instruments, other things like that. So send me your plan, and then what I'll do is I'll compile them all. I want to make sure that they're not offensive, you're not going overboard. But things like dress codes are a way you could practice assimilation, right? Like kind of like the First Nations in the residential schools, they could not wear the traditional clothes. So that's why we're looking at, perhaps you're going to ban sports jerseys in school. So we just want to get an idea for this whole concept of assimilation and how could it play out in other smaller ways in our lives, because definitely it was a horrific thing. Has led to widespread substance abuse and suicides, and we're still reckoning with it today. So yeah, definitely always a very tough topic, but I think the fact that as Canadians we're speaking about our history is definitely the good first step that we can take to try to have a more just and equitable society. So I hope you enjoyed this rather grim lesson, and I will see you in our future Zoom classes. Farewell. Oh, he's got no arms. He's got no arms. Can't wave. Okay, bye-bye. There we go.